Have you ever read novels from some author that seems to just be physically unable to write a bad book? Dmitry Glukhovsky is that man in my esteem. He wrote the hugely influential and popular Metro 2033 trilogy, which is a staple of post-apocalyptic fiction these days. Among other works of his, I'd recommend Future.Re and Outpost, which might just be the scariest book I've ever read. You get the point, everything he writes is just perfect as far as I'm concerned. More relevant to the video, he was assisting in the creation of the Metro series of games, based on his most popular trilogy. They were made by the small Ukrainian studio 4A Games, and the first game suffered hard from being Slavjank, due to being made under tight budget and time constraints, an extremely unfriendly work environment, and being based off the Stalker engine. If this isn't a recipe for Slavjank at its purest, I don't know what is. In 2010, 4A Games released Metro 2033, an unusual adaptation of a book into a video game. It broadly followed the events of the novel and was an alternate take on the same story. It's set in the Moscow metro in the titular year 2033, 20 years after a nuclear annihilation event wiped out human civilization, the remnants of which took refuge down underground. It's a purely single-player first-person shooter, and not much more than that. Perhaps the most unique aspect of this game is that currency you spend on weapons and supplies is your actual ammo. Much like in the books, pre-war military-grade 7.62 rounds for the AK series rifles are both cash and real ammunition you can use for some more bang for a hefty buck. But other than this, the game is extremely linear and hard divided into levels. 4A released a game where most of the choices you make are about where you take cover, which enemies to fight or avoid, what weapons are you using, what do you spend your money on, and the like. Fun decisions to make, but hardly an original formula. You cannot decide which levels you tackle in what order, how to unravel the story, or even go back to an earlier section. 3 years later, they made a game where most of the choices you make are about where you take cover, which enemies to fight or avoid, what weapons are you using, what do you spend your money on, and the like. You cannot decide which levels you tackle in what order, how to unravel the story, or even go back to an earlier section. This game is called Metro Last Light. It's a different story this time and a direct sequel. Whether this game is canon to the books is a can of worms that I'm not gonna delve deep into. Metro 2035 references some events from this game, so if you do some hardcore mental gymnastics, you could fit the books and games together into one timeline. But reading theories online about how it all connects made me want to split open my skull for the tremendous pain inflicted upon it. So let's move on. Next year, we got Redux editions of these two games, of which gameplay you've been seeing so far. They're graphical and engine overhauls, while also being console ports. And in 2019, another true sequel was made, Metro Exodus. It's a purely single-player first-person shooter where you cannot choose which order to tackle the levels in, how to deal with story beats, etc. But I do have a list of innovations as well. Some of the levels are now more open, letting us choose how to explore them. This closes my list of innovations. I think I've made it abundantly clear that I'm not particularly impressed with the innovations brought along to the series over the years. Don't get me wrong, first-person shooters are my favorite genre of games, and the Metro series does them justice. But am I the only one who feels like the rich setting developed by the books could make for some far more creative and systems-driven gameplay? If you know me, you know that I love systems-driven games. I like games which let me learn and explore an intricate set of rules, while providing fun and meaningful decisions to make. Games like Prey 2017, XCOM, Dark Souls. If I'm not making decisions when playing your game, then I want nothing of it. I think the moment this truly struck me was when I was reading the Metro 2033 universe novel, The Right to Use Force. Many of you might not know this, but there's actually literal hundreds of novels set in the Metro 2033 universe, written by various authors and set in all corners of the world. The reason they're not well known amongst the Anglospheric audience is because none of them were translated into English. but many of them are available in various other European languages, like Polish, Italian, German, and the like, meaning I got to read about a dozen of them in my native tongue before I got a bit sick of trudging through some borderline amateur work in order to be able to find the real gems, some of which are even better than the mainline trilogy in my view. But anyway, while the overarching plot of this specified novel was not super interesting to me, it presents many scenes of a duo of stalkers exploring the city over their asylum and looting whatever they can find. Simple moments like one of them entering a long forgotten shop to grab anything useful while the other one holds watch outside for any mutants. Or how they lay hidden in a ruined house for entire hours while one of them is struck down with illness. Or a tactical coordinated assault by a squad of special forces on a caravan. I know that if I was to experience such moments in one of the games, they would be purely scripted events, where the characters always move and react the same way, nobody dies without an immediate reload of the game, everything is like watching a film or reading a book. I couldn't help but imagine a game where these are choices that I have to make. A game where I pick where to go, I pick how we handle about exploring the place, I pick what gear to bring, and the events of this expedition might have long-term consequences I wasn't expecting. These choices will feel so much more important and impactful if I found some piece of gear inside that is nowhere else in the game, or if my companion could just die and the game would carry on without them. Imagine if, while playing through Half-Life 2 Episode 1, Alex just died and the game didn't do a game over screen but just carried on. Her death would be something to deal with. She wouldn't be there to help you anymore, give you useful hints, or assist in combat. If Half-Life or Metro were immersive sims, you would be able to do that. Your playthrough would now have some personality and identity with one unique choice. You know what I like about Prey 2017? You can do a ton of things to impact how the game unfolds. You can just kill January, the closest thing to a story-critical NPC in this game, as soon as you meet them for the first time, and the game carries on. You can kill anyone and the game carries on. The only situation you can't brute force through is your own demise. There's an important antagonist that comes in the late game, and depending on how you deal with them, you might cause the deaths of other characters, along with all associated consequences. You might even entirely lock yourself out of one of the endings. Furthermore, the game is divided into zones, but you can travel between them as you please. When starting out, you won't have access to most of the space station, but you will be finding keycards and unlocking access to progressively larger sections of the game. Let's say you're down at the very bottom of the station, down in the power plant, and have to get up to the opposite end, where the Arboretum lies. You have multiple options of traversal. Going to life support, you can take the zero gravity utility tunnel running along the entire length of the station, or take the main lift, if you've managed to get it working again, or even just spacewalk all the way, but this requires you to have already been up there to unlock the airlock. Also, I thought I'd add this little update in. The Arcane studio that made Prey 2017 has been shut down a few days ago as of the writing of this script. So if you're a Prey fanatic like me, I hope you weren't praying for a Prey 2 too hard. Metro Exodus actually took some steps towards such a state of affairs. There are 2 open world hubs as levels in the game, which lets you choose what locations you want to explore, while finding unique loot and challenges. However, I have a preference for interconnected worlds over purely open ones, just because navigating such maps is more interesting instead of just holding W until you've reached your destination. It also lets you get more familiar and learn the quirks and features of your environment. You also cannot go back to previous levels, and there's only 2 open world sections, and the rest is a classic on-rails metro train. Also, what happened to that relations system the devs were teasing before release? They made it sound like this was going to be some RPG or RTS level system, but all we really got was a slightly more complex version of the morality system we've had for the past two games instead. The only difference being that there are 3 points of divergence in the story instead of just one. Let's analyze these points now. For 3 of the levels, there's a character that can have their fates changed depending on what you've done. This has a meager impact on the story. It basically just affects whether they're on the train with you, and some dialogue between the rest of the crew. It also determines whether you get the good or bad ending, but beyond these story consequences, there's not much to talk about. The choices you make also only have an indirect effect on the outcome for this level. It's not like a character dies because you failed to protect them in a firefight or something. It's basically some hidden formula that calculates how well you did, and based on if you meet the threshold of goodness, it will kick in one of the two outcomes. So it literally does just feel like some hidden formula instead of a direct consequence of your actions. Why am I rambling about all this? Because the Metro setting is such a good canvas for such gameplay setups. A Metro system isn't quite open world, but there are multiple ways to get to different places. Picture a scenario where you have to get to some station for some story objective. Not only do you have multiple options in a navigational sense, but also what happens along the way. You could choose to pay a hefty toll to be granted safe passage through a secure tunnel, or you could choose to brave it across the irradiated surface, but potentially pay with your life. Such a choice alone would add so much more depth and player agency to the game. Am I the only one, or does this sound like a banging premise for a game? Now, I bet a lot of the Metro Last Light DLC enthusiasts have been screaming at their screen this entire time. And for those who don't know what I'm talking about, let me introduce you to Kshatriya. This is an additional level in the game that isn't all that related to the main game. The premise is that you are a stalker working for police, and the level is about going out onto the surface to collect artifacts of the old world. You can explore the area, grab some, and come back to sell them for money to spend on weapons and upgrades. The level is surprisingly linear, and it recycles the library section from the previous game. But it does add an interconnectivity to it, where you unlock new passages to travel around the area, return to base, and come back vaguely where you left off. Your main goal is to reach the depository and find a map of Metro 2. The level ends once you return it back. Kshatriya is kind of what I'm asking for, but expanded to be an entire game. As far as I can tell, this might have been the best received DLC level from this game, and it certainly deserves this reputation. It gives us far more freedom and far less restrictions on what to do, even though the overall idea is so simple. You're just walking around collecting random shit. The level executes this idea in such a compelling and elegant way that I can't help but love it. Given this level's status in the community, I'm kind of baffled as to why the devs didn't take notes and carry over some lessons to Exodus. Now, imagine that the system of metro tunnels is not the only place we can venture, but also have a whole overworld portion. The underground layer of humans would be mapped out for you, but the city above is uncharted territory. You have to carefully explore every corner you haven't been to, and be under constant watch. Imagine being able to collect artifacts and supplies from above to sell for a living. Let's say you could specialize your loadout for this scenario in order to be able to better equip yourself in the long run. My head is swirling with possibilities, and I bet many of you feel the same way. The Metro games we've received so far are perfectly fine games, and I have played them many times. But the Metro setting is so rich and bustling with opportunity that I wish very hard for more studios to try their hand at their own takes on a Metro game, if they can get the licensing for it. I'm not even saying it has to be an FPS, make it a fucking city builder where you manage your own station, if you have to. The games we've got so far have stagnated and become stale in their formulaic adherence to tradition that I'm pining for literally anything different.